Today I'm going to be talking to you about the project that I'm doing my final project on, and it's focusing on redefining how success is measured for Indigenous people. And I'll be talking about the current issues that are in place in schools and how it links to this Vygotsky sociocultural theory, and using the holistic lifelong learning framework to begin having engaging discussion of how success should be measured for Indigenous peoples. So the current issues is a lot of the schools impose a westernized ways of learning, and this involves colonial knowledge, values, perspectives in schools with little to none inclusion of Indigenous perspectives. Education is focused on test scores, um, and the current approaches to measuring the Indigenous learning focus on the performance on standardized assessments. It doesn't reflect the purpose of what it means to be a holistic learner or learning holistically, which includes a physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional dimensions. And our assessment tools measuring how people really learn. So, in order to support Indigenous student success, this links to the Indigenous pedagogy, where elements such as self-identification is included, the identity of the learner, the language. The language is part of identity to the learners. The prior knowledge students bring into the school, the traditional knowledge that's the child has learned or will learn, and of course the sources of knowledge, that not all learning just happens in the classroom, that it also happens with the parents, the elders on the land, connected to the traditions, cultures, and values. So this links to Vygotsky's social cultural theory, and where it focuses the important contribution that society makes to individual development. It stresses the interaction between developing people and the culture in which they live, focuses on how cultural beliefs and attitudes impact how instruction and learning takes place, which is really aligned with the Indigenous pedagogy, and how culture provides what he referred to as tools of intellectual adaptation, and that these tools allow for children to use their mental abilities in a way that is adapted to the culture in which they live in. Just to before I show you the holistic learning framework, I just want to touch a little bit of what learning means for Indigenous people. Learning is lifelong, something that happens throughout your life. It's experiential, so it's connected to the land, the traditions, the ceremonies children observe and then imitate. It's rooted in Aboriginal languages and culture, that all of these are part of the identity of the individual. Spiritually oriented, this is where we connect to Mother Earth as a spirit and all our surroundings. Communal activity and integrating Aboriginal and Western knowledge together, and how we can balance a bit of both. So I will now show you the holistic framework, and I will just quickly discuss a little bit about what the whole the whole model means. So the model is portrayed as a holistic lifelong development process that contributes to individual and community well-being, that it's organic and self-regenerative in nature, and it integrates various types of relationships and knowledge within the community. And it's using the style graphic as a living tree to depict learning as a cyclical process that occurs throughout the individual's lifespan. And the tree identifies the conditions that foster cultural continuity and provide the foundation for individual learning and collective well-being. So the roots are considered the foundations of the learning foundations, and it involves family, self, ancestors, community, other nations, and in their experiences, language, traditions, and ceremonies. And this is the roots of the learning that is to take place in one's individual life. The next is the branches, which is here: political, economic, social, cultural, and all of these with a balance of spiritual, physical, mental, emotional dimensions as being depict the developments upwarding in an upward from the trunk, where it continues to be a personal development through all those through cultural, social, economic, and political um, development of an individual. And if you can see here, the medicine wheel is represented in the middle, and I'll go in depth with it after. And the leaves um, correspond to all of that as being collective well-being, that you're politically, economically, socially, culturally developing through elders, teachers, parents, mentors, counselors, and the sources of your domain. And all of this is considered the lifelong learner and the well grounded, I guess you could say, of the individual. So if I go back to, I'll do this. So then there's the learning rings of the individual. So that's early learning, and even before, when you're at home, learning at home, elementary school, post-sec, workplace, adult, intergenerational learning, etc. And this is the individual. And the individual is connected to the emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual. And that there's two sides. There is the Western knowledge that is being taught in school, but there's also the Indigenous knowledge and what role that plays for the individual. Currently, a lot of the schools standardized tests only measure the mental, the cognitive aspect of the student, and doesn't really take into account the other three elements, which are important in the learning of the individual. And just to say a little bit about the medicine wheel, the medicine wheel is divided into 4 directions, and these 4 directions represent depending on the context. So for example, it could represent the stages of life: birth, youth, adult, elder to death. It could represent the seasons of the year: spring, summer, winter, and fall. And for the sake of learning, I'm connecting it to these aspects of life that we are all we have all these 4 elements that make us whole as an individual: the spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and physical. And so in my argument for this project is that the other 3 are not really considered, and tend to be devalued in the schools and the way what is defined to be success. And so if I go back to my PowerPoint, sorry. So here I say that I've mentioned the 4 elements, and that they're not being used in the way we measure student achievement in the schools. So from the readings I've included in my project by Sachs, Callegrio, and Hickey, and Toulouse and others, the four key things that I pull out of all of it is that the awareness that there are many kinds of learners, many kinds of learning, and many ways of learning to demonstrate accomplishment, that the cultural identity awareness is part of learning, linking school teachings to cultural context, cultural forces that motivate communities of practice, and increase motivation for students to learn and practice in knowledge communities. And all of these would be ways of how we can begin assessing students more than just the intellectual, the physical, the social, and the other elements. So what does this mean? Well, based on the readings that I did and the looking at the holistic lifelong learning framework and looking at the current school systems, well, we have to refine these social culture views and use that on assessment to motivate students. We got to begin raising questions regarding existing educational problems. We have to see assessment as purposes, and that's to assist learning to measure individual achievement and to evaluate programs. We have to work, pay attention, and engage in ongoing commitment to reflect on the practices and renewing relationships between the teachers, the schools, and all the stakeholders involved. We have to begin linking school teachings to the cultural context of the students. We have to revamp assessment to enable more valid and fair inferences about student level of understanding, their thinking strategies, and nature of their misunderstandings. And of course, the important one is to engage in dialogue with all stakeholders, where we look at how current standardized assessments tools do not fit to our individual students' needs, and how can we use the holistic lifelong framework to begin engaging in this dialogue. So the Truth and Reconciliation has really pushed for this type of renewing of relationships and renewing of how we speak about Indigenous success. And if we do that, then we begin to start moving away from just looking at the success based on only how well the students do in standardized testing, which is what's happening currently today, that a lot of the focus is on the discrepancies in educational attainment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students using these standardized assessment tools. And we need to begin in demonstrating accomplishment for all in other ways, and using the holistic lifelong learning framework would be a way to begin having this discussion.